My name is Harper Quinn, and I've been wrestling with legacy systems and forgotten passwords for 15 years. Most people think ET is about fixing printers and resetting passwords. They're wrong. It is about holding the keys to kingdoms that nobody else understands. And sometimes, when they push you far enough, it's about watching those kingdoms burn. I never thought I'd be the type to orchestrate corporate revenge. I'm more of a keep your head down, fix the servers, go home kind of person. But everyone has a breaking point, and mine came wrapped in a termination letter and delivered by a man who couldn't tell the difference between RAM and ROM. The story begins on a Tuesday morning in September, when the smell of burnt coffee mixed with the low hum of server fans in the basement of Orion Capital Systems. I was elbow deep in debugging a backup pipeline that had been limping along for months, held together by shell scripts I'd written during the Obama administration. The system was ancient by tech standards, but it worked. More importantly, it worked because I understood every line of code, every configuration file, every undocumented workaround that kept the money flowing. Orion wasn't just any company. We managed investment portfolios worth north of $2 billion, and every trade, every transaction, every penny of movement flowed through systems that I'd built, maintained, and nursed back to health more times than I could count. The servers hummed with the quiet confidence of machines that had been running without major incident for years. That morning, I was troubleshooting a particularly stubborn cron job when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that belonged to someone trying to make an impression. I glanced up from my terminal to see a man in his early 30s, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. His hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to actually fix anything. "You must be Harper," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Trey Matheson, the new head of Agile DevOps Transformation." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the way his eyes scanned the server room like he was appraising real estate. "Nice to meet you. What brings you down to the dungeon?" "Just getting familiar with our infrastructure," he said, pulling out a tablet and swiping through what looked like architectural diagrams. "I've been brought in to modernize our operations, move everything to the cloud, implement some proper DevOps practices, bring us into the 21st century. I nodded politely, though something in his tone made my jaw tighten. "How long have you been working with legacy financial systems?" "Well, I spent 3 years at a startup that built microservices for fintech," he said, his chest puffing slightly. "Before that, I was doing container orchestration for a mobile app company. The principles are the same, really. Infrastructure is infrastructure." I bit back my first response, which would have been to explain that financial systems weren't Instagram backends, that regulatory compliance wasn't a buzzword, and that the principles weren't even close to being the same. Instead, I smiled and turned back to my terminal. "Anything specific you need to know about our setup?" "Actually, I'd love to get access to the documentation for all this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the servers. "Network diagrams, configuration files, deployment procedures. I'm putting together a migration plan." I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Migration plan?" "Yeah. We're looking at a complete infrastructure overhaul, cloud-native architecture, containerized services, the works, this stuff." He waved at the servers again. "It's got to go. Way too much technical debt." Technical debt? The phrase hit me like a slap. These weren't just servers, they were the digital backbone of a company that had been profitable for 8 consecutive years. Every cable, every configuration, every seemingly arbitrary piece of code had been battle-tested through market crashes, regulatory audits, and the kind of high-pressure scenarios that separated real systems from PowerPoint presentations. "I'll see what I can pull together," I said, keeping my voice level. "Some of this stuff goes back pretty far. Documentation isn't always comprehensive." "That's exactly the problem," Trey said, making a note on his tablet. "We need systems that are self-documenting, maintainable by any competent developer. Can't have everything dependent on tribal knowledge. Tribal knowledge, Another phrase that made my teeth ache. What he called tribal knowledge. I called 15 years of learning how to keep the lights on when everything else was falling apart. Over the next few weeks, I watched Trey's influence spread through the company like a virus. He scheduled meetings with titles like Digital Transformation Roadmap and Cloud Migration Strategy Session. He brought in consultants who spoke in acronyms and drew diagrams that looked impressive but bore no resemblance to the actual complexity of our systems. The first sign of real trouble came when I was suddenly excluded from the weekly infrastructure meetings. Janet Martinez, the only other person in the building who understood the difference between a database and a spreadsheet, pulled me aside after lunch. "Have you heard anything about budget cuts?" she asked, glancing around the break room. "No. Why?" "HR scheduled a meeting with me for Friday, said they want to discuss role optimization and resource allocation. That's never good." I felt my stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. But Harper, if they're looking to cut costs, we're the obvious targets." Trey's been making presentations about how much money they could save by right-sizing the IT department. That evening, I stayed late in the server room, not because I had work to do, but because I needed to think. The servers hummed their familiar song, and I found myself reviewing the mental inventory of everything I'd built over the years. The custom authentication middleware that handled our regulatory compliance, the backup system that had saved us from 3 separate disk failures, the monitoring scripts that caught problems before they became disasters. All of it was documented, after a fashion. But the documentation was like a cookbook written by someone who assumed you already knew how to cook. The real knowledge, the understanding of why things worked the way they did, existed in my head and nowhere else. I pulled out my worn leather notebook and started writing. Not documentation in the traditional sense, but a kind of map of the digital territory I'd been guarding for 15 years. Every password, every configuration quirk, every undocumented dependency that would cause chaos if it were removed. The termination came on a Friday, because of course it did. I was in the middle of updating the backup rotation schedule when my computer locked itself and displayed a message telling me to report to HR immediately. I knew what was coming before I even stood up. The HR meeting was brief and bloodless. Janet was there, looking like she'd been crying. Trey sat in the corner, pecking at his phone. The HR director, a woman named Patricia, who I'd maybe spoken to 5 times in my entire tenure, read from a script about organizational restructuring and strategic realignment. "Your position is being eliminated effective immediately," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We appreciate your years of service, and we're prepared to offer a generous severance package." I listened to the details of the severance, signed the papers they put in front of me, and collected my personal items from my desk. The whole process took less than an hour. 15 years of institutional knowledge, gone in the time it takes to watch a sitcom. As I walked to my car, I noticed Trey in the parking lot, talking animatedly on his phone. I caught fragments of his conversation. Legacy resources eliminated. Cloud migration accelerated. Significant cost savings. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the building where I'd spent more waking hours than in my own apartment. Then I drove home, opened a bottle of wine, and started making plans. The first part of my plan was simple: disappear. I'd been saving money for years, living below my means out of habit more than necessity. I had enough in the bank to last 6 months without touching my 401k. I found a cabin in Montana, a place with decent internet and no neighbors close enough to bother me. I loaded my truck with essentials and left town without telling anyone where I was going. The second part of my plan was even simpler. Wait. I didn't have to wait long. The first cracks appeared the following Monday. I was sitting on the cabin's porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the lake, when my phone started buzzing. Text after text from Janet, each one more frantic than the last. "Trading platform is down. API authentication failing. Backup system offline. Trey is freaking out. They're asking for you." I set the phone aside and went back to watching the sunrise. The lake was perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the sky. It was the kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The calls started around noon. First Patricia from HR, then someone from the executive team, then Trey himself. I let them all go to voicemail. By evening, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The gist of them was always the same: urgent problem, need immediate assistance, willing to pay consultant rates. The problem, as I'd anticipated, was that the systems I'd built were more interconnected than anyone realized. The backup system wasn't just a backup system, it was also the authentication server for the trading platform. The monitoring scripts weren't just monitoring scripts. They were also the heartbeat that kept certain processes alive. Everything depended on everything else in ways that weren't obvious until something broke. And things were breaking. Fast. I spent the next few days fishing and reading, occasionally glancing at my phone to see the growing desperation in the messages. The stock price was mentioned. Regulatory compliance was mentioned. The possibility of significant financial exposure was mentioned with increasing frequency. On Thursday, I got a call from someone I didn't recognize, a lawyer, it turned out, representing Orion's executive team. He was very polite, very professional, and very clear about what he wanted. Ms. Quinn, we understand you may have concerns about your recent termination. We're prepared to discuss a very generous consulting agreement to help with the current technical difficulties. What kind of difficulties? I asked, though I already knew. I'm told there are some systems that aren't functioning properly, systems that apparently require your specific expertise to resolve. I pretended to consider this. What kind of consulting agreement? We're thinking $50,000 for a week of work, plus expenses, of course. $50,000 for a week of work. To fix problems that wouldn't exist if they hadn't fired me in the first place? I almost laughed. I'll need to think about it, I said. Of course. But I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. The longer these systems remain offline, the more significant the financial impact becomes. After I hung up, I walked down to the lake and sat on the dock. The water was clear enough that I could see fish swimming near the bottom, moving with the kind of purpose that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. I envied them. The truth was, I could have fixed everything remotely in about an hour. A few SSH commands, a couple of configuration changes, and the systems would have been humming along happily. But that would have been too easy, too clean. They'd fired me without a second thought, dismissed my expertise as tribal knowledge, and assumed they could replace me with someone who knew how to say microservices in a PowerPoint presentation. They were about to learn the difference between talking about systems and actually understanding them. I called the lawyer back on Friday morning. I've thought about your offer, I said. I'm not interested in a consulting agreement. I see. Well, perhaps we could discuss the terms. The compensation is certainly negotiable. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. You fired me. You eliminated my position. You decided my expertise wasn't valuable. I'm not interested in proving you wrong. There was a long pause. Ms. Quinn, I think there may have been some miscommunication about the reasons for your termination. No miscommunication. I have the paperwork, organizational restructuring, and strategic realignment, remember? Perhaps we could arrange a meeting. I think we could find a mutually beneficial solution. I'm sure you could, but I'm not interested in being mutually beneficial. I'm interested in being left alone. I hung up and went back to fishing. The weekend brought a new level of desperation. The stock price had dropped 15%. There were rumors about regulatory investigations. Someone leaked to the press that a major financial services company was experiencing significant technical difficulties after laying off key personnel. The story went viral in the tech community. Reddit threads about legacy system revenge popped up overnight. Twitter hashtags like #Orion outage and tribal knowledge started trending. Someone even created a meme featuring a picture of a server room with the caption, "This is what happens when you fire the person who actually knows how things work." I watched it all from my cabin, sipping bourbon and reading the increasingly panicked messages on my phone. The situation had escalated beyond simple system failures. This was a full-blown corporate crisis, and everyone seemed to understand that I was the only one who could fix it. That's when they made their mistake. On Monday morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Trey's voice, but he sounded different, smaller, less confident. "Harper, thank God. We need to talk." "Do we?" "Look, I know there were some hard feelings about the layoffs, but this situation has gotten out of hand. People are panicking. The board is asking questions. We need your help." "My help with what?" "You know what? The systems. Everything's falling apart. The backup system is corrupted. The authentication server is throwing errors, and nobody can figure out how to fix any of it. We've brought in 3 different consulting firms, and they all say the same thing. They need access to the original architect. The original architect was eliminated, remember? For strategic realignment." "Harper, please. I know you're angry. But this isn't just about the company. We have clients, real people, who are depending on us. Their retirement funds, their savings, their futures. If we can't get these systems back online, a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt." It was a good speech, appealing to my sense of responsibility, my concern for the little guy. Under different circumstances, it might have worked, but I'd spent too many years watching executives make decisions based on quarterly earnings reports and then blame the consequences on everyone else. "That's terrible," I said. "Have you tried calling your head of Agile DevOps transformation? I'm sure he can container orchestrate a solution." There was a long silence. "He's been reassigned. Look, we're prepared to offer you a very substantial compensation package. Whatever you want. Name your price." "I don't want your money, Trey. I want to be left alone." "Harper, be reasonable. This is business. Sometimes decisions have to be made that nobody likes, but that doesn't mean we can't work together when it matters. You're right, this is business. And my business is being retired. Permanently." I hung up and turned off my phone. The next few days were blissfully quiet. I hiked, I read, I cooked simple meals and watched the weather change over the lake. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely relaxed. No emergency alerts, no middle-of-the-night pages, no urgent requests to fix something that was broken because someone else had tried to optimize it. But I wasn't naive. I knew the silence wouldn't last. Corporate executives don't give up when billions of dollars are at stake. They escalate. The escalation came in the form of a black SUV parked at the end of my driveway on Thursday morning. 2 men in suits got out and walked up to my cabin. They looked like FBI agents from a TV show. All business and no warmth. "Ms. Quinn, we'd like to speak with you about some technical difficulties at Orion Capital Systems." I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined them on the porch. "You're a long way from Wall Street, gentlemen. We represent certain regulatory agencies that have concerns about the ongoing system outages at Orion. The situation has reached a point where it may constitute a threat to market stability." Market stability. That's a fancy way of saying someone's losing money. This isn't a joke, Ms. Quinn. The systems that are offline handle billions of dollars in transactions. Every day they remain down. The potential for cascading failures increases. We need your cooperation to resolve this situation. My cooperation? I'm not the one who decided to fire the person responsible for those systems. We understand your grievances with your former employer, but this situation has moved beyond corporate politics. There are national security implications here. I almost laughed. National security, it's a hedge fund, not the Pentagon. Financial markets are critical infrastructure. When they fail, people lose their homes, their savings, their livelihoods. Sometimes the personal has to take a back seat to the greater good. The greater good? Right. I sipped my coffee and watched a hawk circling over the lake. Let me ask you something. Did these same national security concerns exist when Orion decided to eliminate my position? Was the greater good considered when they decided my expertise wasn't worth keeping on the payroll? The agents exchanged glances. Ms. Quinn, we're not here to litigate employment decisions. We're here to prevent a potential financial crisis. And I'm here to enjoy my retirement, which, by the way, was forced on me by the same people who are now claiming I'm essential to national security. Yon, we're prepared to offer you immunity from any potential charges related to the current situation. Charges? What charges? Sabotage, destruction of computer systems, conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The list could be quite long, depending on how this situation develops. I set down my coffee cup and stood up. Gentlemen, I think we're done here. I haven't sabotaged anything. I haven't destroyed any systems. I haven't conspired to commit anything. I was fired from my job, and I left. The fact that my former employer can't operate without me isn't my problem. It could become your problem very quickly. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. The situation at Orion is deteriorating rapidly. If it continues, someone will be held responsible. It would be better for everyone if that someone was willing to cooperate voluntarily. I walked back inside and locked the door. Through the window, I watched the agents stand on my porch for a few more minutes before returning to their SUV. They didn't leave immediately. They sat in their car for almost an hour, making phone calls and presumably reporting back to whoever had sent them. That evening, I finally turned my phone back on. The voicemail box was full, the text messages numbered in the hundreds. But mixed in with the desperate pleas and increasingly frantic threats was a message from Janet that made me pause. Harper, I don't know if you're getting these, but I need you to know what's really happening here. It's not just system failures. People are getting hurt. The pension fund for the city employees union is frozen. The endowment for the children's hospital can't access their funds. I know you're angry. And I don't blame you. But please consider coming back. Not for them, but for the people who don't deserve to suffer because of corporate stupidity. I stared at the message for a long time. Janet wasn't management. She wasn't an executive trying to protect her bonus or a lawyer trying to avoid liability. She was a working person who understood that sometimes the little guy gets caught in the crossfire of other people's wars. I walked outside and sat on the dock, my feet dangling in the cool water. The stars were brilliant in the Montana sky, unobscured by city lights or smog. It was the kind of night that made you feel small and significant at the same time. The truth was, I could fix everything. I'd built those systems with safeguards and redundancies that would allow for graceful recovery even in the worst-case scenario. But accessing those safeguards required knowledge that existed only in my head and in the notebook I'd carried with me when I left. I thought about the pension fund, about the children's hospital, about all the people who had trusted their money to an institution that had decided their IT infrastructure was too expensive to maintain properly. They didn't deserve to suffer because of my grudge against corporate stupidity, but they also didn't deserve to suffer because of that same corporate stupidity in the first place. I made my decision. The next morning, I called Patricia in HR. Harper, thank God, we've been trying to reach you for days. I know, I got your messages. We're prepared to offer you whatever you need. Salary, benefits, stock options, name your terms. I don't want a job, Patricia. I want a contract. A contract? A very specific contract. $1 million, paid in advance, non-refundable. I fix your systems. I document everything properly. And then I disappear forever. No ongoing support, no maintenance contracts, no emergency calls. One and done. There was a long pause. $1 million is substantial. Your stock price has dropped 25% in the last week. Your regulatory compliance is in jeopardy. Your clients are threatening to pull their funds. How much is substantial compared to that? I'll need to discuss this with the board. You have until 5 o'clock. After that, the offer expires and I go back to fishing. They called back at 4:30. The board has approved your terms, Patricia said. When can you start? I'll be there Monday morning. Have the money transferred to my account before I arrive, or I turn around and go home. Of course. And Harper, thank you. Don't thank me yet. You might not like what I have to say when this is over. I spent the weekend preparing, not just technically, but mentally. I was about to walk back into a building where I'd been treated like a disposable asset, where my expertise had been dismissed as tribal knowledge, Where I'd been eliminated for strategic realignment, it wasn't going to be a pleasant homecoming, but I had a job to do. And despite everything, I still took pride in doing jobs well. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for the occasion. I drove back to the city, parked in the same spot I'd used for years, and walked into the Orion building carrying my old laptop bag and leather notebook. The office was eerily quiet. The usual buzz of conversation and keyboard clicks was replaced by the tense silence of people trying to look busy while everything fell apart around them. I could see the stress in everyone's faces, the way they avoided eye contact when they saw me. Trey was waiting for me in the lobby, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his expensive clothes were wrinkled. He tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Harper, I can't tell you how glad we are to see you. Where do you want me to work? Your old office is still available. We haven't had time to reassign it yet." I followed him to the elevator, noting how he kept glancing at me like I might vanish at any moment. We rode down to the basement in silence, the familiar hum of the server room growing louder as we descended. My old office looked exactly as I'd left it, the same desk, the same chair, the same stack of technical manuals that nobody else ever bothered to read. Even my coffee mug was still there, growing what looked like a small ecosystem in the bottom. "I'll leave you to it," Trey said, backing toward the door. "If you need anything at all, just let me know. I need everyone to stay out of my way. No meetings, no status updates, no questions about timeline. I'll let you know when I'm done." After he left, I sat in my chair and took a deep breath. The server room smelled the same, ozone and dust, and the faint metallic tang of electronic components. It was the smell of work, of systems humming along doing their job without fanfare or recognition. I opened my notebook and started reviewing the map I'd drawn of the digital infrastructure. Every system, every connection, every dependency. It was like looking at the blueprint of a city that I'd designed and built myself. A city that was now partially in ruins because the new mayor had decided that traffic lights were too expensive to maintain. The first step was assessment. I needed to understand exactly what had broken and why. I connected to the monitoring systems, pulled up the logs, and started tracing the cascade of failures that had brought everything to a halt. It was worse than I'd expected. The new team hadn't just failed to maintain the systems, they'd actively broken them. Someone had tried to optimize the database by changing the indexing strategy, which had corrupted the backup system. Someone else had attempted to modernize the authentication server by replacing my carefully crafted security middleware with an off-the-shelf solution that didn't understand the specific requirements of financial transactions. It was like watching a master craftsman's workshop be torn apart by enthusiastic amateurs who thought they could improve on decades of experience with a few YouTube tutorials. But the damage wasn't irreparable. I'd built these systems with the assumption that someday, someone would try to fix what wasn't broken. Every critical component had hidden safeguards, backup configurations, and recovery procedures that existed in layers beneath the surface. I worked through the day without stopping for lunch, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I navigated through systems that most people would consider impossibly complex. But they weren't complex to me. They were familiar, like rooms in a house I'd lived in for 15 years. By evening, I had the authentication server stabilized and the backup system partially restored. The trading platform was still offline, but it was no longer hemorrhaging data. It was progress, visible progress, and I could sense the relief spreading through the building like a wave. Janet appeared in my doorway around 6 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a sandwich. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the food on my desk. "Thanks. How's the mood upstairs?" "Cautiously optimistic. Word is spreading that you're making progress. The stock price is already starting to recover." "Good. Maybe people will stop panicking long enough to let me work." She sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair she'd occupied during countless late-night troubleshooting sessions over the years. "Harper, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "What?" "Are you going to fix this and then disappear forever? Because if you are, I need to know. I need to start looking for another job." I stopped typing and looked at her. Janet had been my closest colleague, the one person in the building who understood that keeping systems running was more important than making them look good in presentations. She'd been caught in the middle of this whole mess, probably spending the last 2 weeks dealing with panicked executives and broken systems while trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. "Yes," I said. "I'm going to fix this and then disappear forever." "I figured." She sipped her coffee and stared at the floor. "Any chance you'd consider taking me with you? I mean, not literally, but maybe recommending me for wherever you end up next?" "You don't want to work for wherever I end up next. Why not?" "Because I'm not ending up anywhere. I'm done with corporate IT. Done with being treated like a replaceable part in someone else's machine. After this, I'm going to find a small town somewhere and maybe fix computers for the local library. Or teach high school kids how to code, or just sit on my porch and read books." "That sounds nice, actually." "It is nice. You should try it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the clicking of my keyboard and the steady hum of the servers. It felt like old times, before the politics and the restructuring and the endless meetings about optimization and strategic alignment. "Harper?" "Yeah?" "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about what happened to you. It wasn't right." "I know. But sometimes not right is what finally pushes you to do what you should have done years ago." The next morning, I arrived early and dove back into the restoration process. The authentication server was fully operational, and the backup system was running its first complete cycle in over a week. The trading platform was the last major piece of the puzzle, and it was the most complex. The platform wasn't just software. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of databases, APIs, security protocols, and regulatory compliance checks. Every trade had to be validated, recorded, reported, and backed up according to strict federal guidelines. The system had to be fast enough to handle thousands of transactions per second, secure enough to protect billions of dollars, and reliable enough to operate without interruption. Building it had taken me 3 years. Breaking it had taken the new team 3 days. I spent the morning untangling the mess they'd made of the core trading engine. They'd tried to replace my custom transaction processing logic with a pre-built solution that was designed for e-commerce, not financial services. It was like trying to use a screwdriver to perform heart surgery. The tool wasn't inherently bad, but it was completely wrong for the job. By noon, I had the platform accepting test transactions. By evening, it was ready for live trading. I ran a series of validation tests, checked the regulatory compliance reports, and verified that every backup system was functioning properly. Then I did something I'd never done before. I wrote comprehensive documentation, not just the technical specifications and configuration files, but a complete guide to understanding why the systems worked the way they did. I explained the design decisions, the trade-offs, the reasons behind every seemingly arbitrary choice. I documented the tribal knowledge that had lived in my head for 15 years. It took me 2 more days to finish the documentation. When I was done, I had created a manual that would allow any competent system administrator to maintain, troubleshoot, and even modify the infrastructure without needing to call me in the middle of the night. On Thursday afternoon, I walked upstairs to find Trey. He was in his office, looking significantly more relaxed than he had at the beginning of the week. The color had returned to his face, and his clothes were once again pressed and spotless. "Harper, I was just about to come find you. I've been getting reports that everything is running smoothly. The board is thrilled." "Everything is running smoothly, and it will continue to run smoothly as long as people stop trying to fix what isn't broken." "Absolutely. We've learned our lesson. No more unauthorized changes to critical systems." I set a thick binder on his desk. "This is complete documentation for everything I've built over the years. System architectures, configuration procedures, troubleshooting guides. Everything someone would need to maintain the infrastructure properly." He flipped through the binder, his eyes widening as he saw the scope of the documentation. "This is incredible. This must have taken you years to put together." "It took me 3 days. The knowledge took me 15 years. Well, I can't thank you enough." This is exactly what we needed to ensure business continuity going forward. Good, because this is the last time you'll see me. His smile faltered slightly. What do you mean? I mean my contract is complete. The systems are fixed, the documentation is comprehensive, and I'm done. Don't call me if something breaks. Don't email me if you have questions. Don't send lawyers to my cabin if you decide you need my help. I'm officially retired from the business of keeping other people's mistakes from destroying their companies. But surely we could work out some kind of ongoing arrangement, a maintenance contract, maybe just a few hours a month to ensure everything stays optimal. No. Harper, be reasonable. You're the only one who truly understands these systems. What if something happens that isn't covered in the documentation? Then you'll figure it out. Or you'll hire someone who can figure it out. Or you'll fail. But you won't do it with my help. I stood up and walked toward the door. Oh, and Trey? Next time you want to modernize a system, try learning how it works first. It might save you $1 million. I left him sitting there, staring at the documentation binder like it contained the secrets of the universe. In a way, it did. It contained 15 years of hard-won knowledge about building and maintaining systems that actually worked, as opposed to systems that looked good in presentations. I cleaned out my office one last time, packing my personal items into the same box I'd used when they fired me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked through the server room, listening to the familiar hum of machines that would continue running long after I was gone. They were good machines, well-designed and properly maintained. They deserved better than to be treated as disposable infrastructure. As I walked to the elevator, I passed Janet's cubicle. She looked up from her computer and smiled. All done? All done. I left you a copy of the documentation. You're the only person here who'll actually read it. What are you going to do now? I'm going to drive back to Montana, sit on my dock, and catch some fish. Maybe I'll read some books. Maybe I'll learn to play guitar. Maybe I'll just enjoy the silence. That sounds perfect. It is perfect. Or at least, it's perfect for me. I rode the elevator to the lobby, walked across the marble floor, and pushed through the glass doors into the afternoon sunlight. My truck was waiting in the parking lot, loaded with everything I owned that mattered. I got in, started the engine, and drove away from Orion Capital Systems for the last time. The drive back to Montana took 2 days. I stopped at a small diner outside of Denver, ordered a burger and fries, and sat in a booth by the window, watching traffic crawl past on the interstate. My phone was buzzing with messages, but I didn't check them. There was nothing anyone could say that would change my mind about what I'd decided to do. At the next table, a young couple was arguing about money. The woman was pregnant, and the man was trying to explain that they couldn't afford to buy a house until he got a promotion. They were stressed, worried about the future, trying to build a life together in a world that seemed designed to make that as difficult as possible. I thought about all the people whose money had been frozen during the Orion outage. The pension funds, the hospital endowments, the retirement accounts of people who had worked hard their whole lives and trusted their futures to institutions that viewed them as line items on a balance sheet. They hadn't deserved to suffer because of corporate arrogance and mismanagement, but they also shouldn't have to depend on the goodwill of people like me to protect their interests. The system was broken in ways that went far beyond technical failures. It was broken because it treated people as expendable, whether they were employees or customers or the general public whose lives were disrupted when the machine stopped working. I finished my burger, left a generous tip, and got back on the road. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. The lake was still mirror smooth, the mountains still stood guard over the valley, and the silence was still deep and healing. I unloaded my truck, made a pot of coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. My phone had finally stopped buzzing. The messages had tapered off from desperate pleas to angry demands to resigned acceptance. The last one, from Patricia in HR, simply said, "Thank you for your service. Your final payment has been processed." I deleted all the messages without reading most of them. Whatever Orion was dealing with now, whatever crises or celebrations or corporate reshuffling was happening in those gleaming offices, it was no longer my concern. I had built something that worked, documented it properly, and walked away. The rest was up to them. Over the next few weeks, I followed the aftermath from a distance. The tech blogs and financial news sites had picked up the story, turning it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of eliminating institutional knowledge. Some painted me as a hero, a David who had defeated the corporate Goliath. Others called me vindictive, suggesting that I had deliberately sabotaged systems to prove my own importance. Both narratives missed the point. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had simply built systems that required understanding rather than just operation. And when the people who understood them were eliminated, the systems failed. It wasn't revenge, it was consequence. The story spawned discussion threads on Reddit and Hacker News, with hundreds of comments from other IT professionals sharing their own tales of corporate short-sightedness. A hashtag started trending: tribal knowledge, used by people posting stories about the irreplaceable expertise that companies routinely threw away in the name of efficiency. One comment stuck with me, posted by someone with the username A Legacy Defender. Legacy doesn't mean old. Legacy means everything else stops working when you remove it. That became my philosophy for retirement. I wasn't old, I was legacy. And now that I had removed myself from the equation, everyone would have to learn to work without me. The autumn in Montana was spectacular. The aspen trees turned brilliant gold, and the lake reflected the changing sky like a sheet of polished metal. I spent my days hiking, reading, and learning to appreciate the luxury of boredom. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without being awakened by emergency alerts or anxiety dreams about server failures. I started a small consulting practice, but not the kind you might expect. Instead of helping corporations optimize their infrastructure, I worked with small nonprofits and local government agencies, organizations that needed basic IT support but couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. I helped the county library set up a new network, taught the volunteer fire department how to maintain their dispatch system, and built a simple database for the animal shelter to track adoptions. It was work that mattered in small, concrete ways. When I fixed the library's computers, kids could do their homework. When I secured the fire department's communications, first responders could save lives more effectively. When I streamlined the animal shelter's processes, more pets found homes. The pay was minimal, but I didn't need much money anymore. My contract with Orion had set me up comfortably, and my needs were simple: a warm cabin, good coffee, fresh fish from the lake, and books to read on quiet evenings. It was a life that would have seemed impossibly modest to my younger self, but it felt rich in ways that salary and stock options never had. Sometimes I wondered what had happened to the people I'd left behind. Janet had sent me a few emails in the months after I left, updating me on the corporate reshuffling that had followed the crisis. Trey had been quietly reassigned to a position with no actual authority. The board had brought in a new CTO with instructions to hire experienced infrastructure engineers and treat them as essential personnel rather than cost centers. The systems I'd built continued to run smoothly, maintained by a team of professionals who actually read the documentation I'd left behind. There were occasional hiccups, but nothing that threatened the stability of the entire platform. The tribal knowledge had been successfully transferred, proving that it was possible to document and preserve institutional expertise if you were willing to invest the time and effort to do it properly. Winter in Montana was harsh but beautiful. The lake froze solid, and snow covered the mountains like a white blanket. I learned to snowshoe, spent long evenings reading by the fireplace, and discovered that silence could be its own form of entertainment. The isolation that might have driven some people crazy felt like a gift to me after years of constant connectivity and urgent interruptions. On New Year's Eve, I sat on my porch wrapped in a heavy coat, watching fireworks bloom over the distant town. My phone was inside, turned off, because I had no one to call and no one I wanted to hear from. It wasn't loneliness, it was contentment. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged completely to myself. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. The local community college asked me to teach a course on basic computer maintenance. The students were a mix of returning adults and recent high school graduates, all eager to learn practical skills that would help them find decent jobs in a changing economy. Teaching turned out to be more rewarding than I had expected. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone's face light up when they finally understood how a network protocol worked, or when they successfully diagnosed and fixed their first hardware problem. These weren't abstract concepts or corporate optimization strategies. They were real skills that real people could use to build better lives. One of my students, a single mother named Maria who was trying to transition from retail work to a career in IT, reminded me why the work mattered. She had been laid off from her job at a department store and was using her unemployment benefits to pay for classes, hoping to find something more stable and better paying. "Professor Quinn," she said after class one day, "I wanted to thank you for explaining things so clearly. Most of the online tutorials assume you already know stuff that nobody ever taught me. You make it seem possible." "It is possible," I told her. "The technology isn't as complicated as people pretend it is. It just requires patience and practice." "Were you always this good at it?" I thought about that question for a moment. "No, I was terrible when I started. I made every mistake you could imagine, and some you probably couldn't. But I kept trying. And eventually I stopped making the same mistakes twice. That's really all expertise is, making new mistakes instead of old ones." She laughed. "That actually makes me feel better." Good. The people who act like they were born knowing this stuff are either lying or have forgotten what it was like to be a beginner. Everyone starts somewhere. As the months passed, I watched my students develop confidence and competence. Several of them found good jobs, including Maria, who was hired by a regional bank to help maintain their branch office networks. She sent me a thank you card with a picture of her daughter, writing, "You changed our lives. Thank you for believing we could do it." It was the kind of feedback that made all the corporate frustration and political maneuvering seem worthwhile. I had spent 15 years building systems that made rich people richer. Now I was helping ordinary people build skills that would make their lives more stable and secure. It felt like a better use of my expertise. 2 years after leaving Orion, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in my garden, planting tomatoes, and thinking about the networking class I would teach that evening, when I heard a car coming up the gravel driveway. It was a rental car, which was unusual. Most of my neighbors drove trucks or SUVs built for mountain roads. The driver was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, but not ostentatiously so. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but comfortable exercising it quietly. She got out of the car and approached me with a confident stride. "Ms. Quinn, I'm Jennifer Walsh, CTO of Pacific Trust Financial. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." I wiped my hands on my jeans and studied her face. She didn't look like a corporate headhunter or a lawyer. She looked like someone who had climbed the ranks by solving problems rather than creating them. "What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" "I've heard about your work at Orion Capital, and I'm familiar with some of the documentation you created there. It's become something of a legend in our industry. I'm here because I have a proposition that I think might interest you." "I'm not interested in corporate consulting work." "I'm not offering corporate consulting work. I'm offering something different." She pulled a tablet from her briefcase and showed me a presentation. The slides described a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preserving and sharing institutional knowledge in the technology sector. The organization would work with companies to document critical systems, train replacement personnel, and prevent the kind of catastrophic knowledge loss that had nearly destroyed Orion. "We're calling it the Legacy Foundation," she explained. "The goal is to create a resource that benefits everyone. Companies get better continuity planning. Workers get recognition for their expertise, and the industry as a whole becomes more resilient." "Interesting. What does this have to do with me?" "We want you to be our founding technical director. You would work with companies to identify their knowledge gaps, develop documentation standards, and train the next generation of infrastructure engineers. The work would be part consulting, part teaching, part advocacy." I considered the proposal. It was appealing in some ways, but I had learned to be skeptical of grand plans that promised to fix systemic problems. Who's funding this foundation? A consortium of tech companies, financial institutions, and government agencies. Everyone who has been burned by preventable system failures. Orion is actually one of our largest contributors. Orion wants to fund a foundation to prevent the kind of problem they created. Orion learned an expensive lesson. So did a lot of other companies. They're willing to invest in preventing future disasters, even if it means admitting they made mistakes. Yo, and what makes you think I'm interested in working with the same companies that created these problems in the first place? Jennifer smiled. Because you've already proven that you can solve the problems, and because the alternative is letting the same mistakes happen over and over again to new generations of workers. She had a point. Walking away from corporate dysfunction had been personally satisfying, but it hadn't changed the underlying dynamics that led to that dysfunction. If anything, my story had become a cautionary tale that might make executives think twice before eliminating experienced personnel. But it hadn't created systematic change. I'd want to see the foundation's charter, I said. And I'd want guarantees about editorial independence. If I'm going to do this work, it gets done properly, even if that means telling people things they don't want to hear. Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what we need. Someone with enough credibility and independence to speak truth to power. We talked for another hour, discussing the scope of the work, the structure of the foundation, and the resources that would be available. It wasn't the quiet retirement I had planned, but it was meaningful work that could prevent other people from experiencing the kind of professional betrayal I had endured. I'll need some time to think about it, I said finally. Of course. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. You have an opportunity to turn your experience into institutional change. That's not something many people get. After she left, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set over the lake. The water was perfectly calm, reflecting the mountains and sky like a mirror. It was the kind of peace that I had fought hard to achieve, and I wasn't eager to give it up. But I also thought about Maria and my other students, about all the people who were just starting their careers in technology, who would face the same arbitrary decisions and corporate short-sightedness that had defined my own experience. Maybe there was a way to help them that went beyond teaching basic networking concepts. I called Jennifer Walsh the next morning. I'll do it, I said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, the foundation operates independently. No corporate oversight of our recommendations or findings. Second, we focus on worker protection as much as business continuity. And third, if a company doesn't want to hear what we have to say, we publish our findings anyway. Agreed. When can you start? Give me a month to finish the semester here. I have students who are counting on me. Of course, we'll have offices ready for you in Seattle, but you can work remotely as much as you need. We understand that good work doesn't require constant supervision. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Someone had finally learned that treating experts like professionals produced better results than treating them like interchangeable resources. 3 years later, the Legacy Foundation had documented over 200 critical systems at 50 different organizations. We had trained thousands of engineers in knowledge preservation techniques, lobbied for legislation protecting workers from arbitrary termination, and published research showing the true cost of institutional knowledge loss. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying. We were changing the conversation about expertise, shifting it from overhead to be minimized to assets to be preserved. Companies were starting to understand that the people who kept their systems running were not just expensive maintenance costs, but strategic resources that required investment and protection. I still kept the cabin in Montana, still spent my weekends fishing and hiking and enjoying the silence, but I also had work that mattered, work that honored the expertise I had spent decades developing while helping others avoid the mistakes that had nearly derailed my own career. On quiet evenings, I sometimes pulled out my old leather notebook and read through the entries I had made during those final weeks at Orion. The anger and frustration were still there, but they were tempered now by the knowledge that those experiences had led to something larger and more meaningful than personal revenge. Legacy doesn't mean old, as that anonymous commenter had written. Legacy means everything else stops working when you remove it. But legacy also means that the knowledge and experience you've gained can outlive the specific circumstances that created it, can become the foundation for something better and more enduring. I had learned to stop thinking of myself as disposable, and in doing so, I had helped others learn the same lesson. It wasn't the ending I had expected when I drove away from Orion with a box of personal belongings and a plan for quiet retirement, but it was better than anything I could have planned. Sometimes the best revenge is not just proving them wrong, but making sure they can never make the same mistake again.